I am 40 years old, and the first thing I feel every morning is not the weight of my age, but the echo of something done to me before I had language for pain. It wakes with me, a dull insistence beneath the skin, as if my body never received the message that time was supposed to move on. Some wounds are taught to close. Mine was taught to be silent. I learned early how to separate myself from sensation. As a child, I thought this was a skill everyone developed, like learning to read faces or lowering your voice when elders entered the room. When my legs stiffened for no reason, when heat rose suddenly in my chest and my breath shortened, I told myself it was weakness. That was the word I inherited. Weakness. A flaw of character rather than a message from flesh. I wore it quietly, the way other girls wore beads or scars that were praised as marks of belonging. The day it happened exists in my body more clearly than in my memory. I remember the smell of dust and boiled leaves, the way the women's voices blended into something almost musical, the ceiling fan that didn't work and still managed to make noise. I remember being told to be brave, being told that this was how love looked when it was serious. After that, memory fractures. My body remembers what my mind was forced to abandon in order to survive. No one asked me how I felt afterward. There was no afterward, only before and silence. Pain was treated as proof that something important had been accomplished, and any sign of continued suffering was framed as ingratitude. I learned to walk carefully, to sit carefully, to laugh carefully. I learned that discomfort was a private failure, not a shared concern. When I bled longer than expected, when infections came and went like unwanted visitors, I was told my body would adjust. Tradition, they said, knows what it's doing. At school, I studied biology with a strange double vision. I could recite diagrams and processes while feeling like a poorly drawn exception in the margins. The textbooks spoke of healing as a natural sequence: injury, repair, restoration. My experience did not follow the page. What was altered never reorganized itself into wholeness. Instead, it hardened into something permanent, something that affected how I moved through the world in ways no one could see and everyone expected me to deny. As I grew older, the consequences widened. Intimacy became a negotiation with fear. Doctors, offices felt like courtrooms where my body was evidence I did not know how to present. Some professionals avoided naming what they saw, others named it quickly and moved on, as if the word itself were treatment enough. Each time, I left with the same understanding. What had been done was irreversible, and the expectation was that I would make peace with that fact on my own. The most damaging lesson was not the pain itself, but the framing of it. I was taught that suffering could be virtuous if it served a collective idea, that harm could be erased by calling it heritage. Over time, this lesson seeped into how I judged myself and others. I stayed quiet when younger girls disappeared into closed rooms. I told myself it was not my place. Silence, too, was a tradition. Now, at 40, I can finally say what my body has been saying all along. It never healed because it was never meant to. The injury was the point. And understanding that has split something open in me that no scar ever could. The realization does not bring comfort, but it brings clarity, and clarity has its own kind of force. What began as a private ache is becoming a question I can no longer keep to myself, one that will not allow me the luxury of looking away. For most of my life, pain existed without vocabulary. It was an atmosphere, not a condition, something I navigated rather than confronted. I planned my days around it the way others planned around weather, adjusting movements, anticipating flares, pretending adaptability was the same as health. What changed was not the pain itself, but my exhaustion with pretending I did not need to understand it. The appointment that altered everything was not dramatic. No raised voices, no sudden revelations. Just a narrow room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and a woman across from me who did not rush. She asked questions no one had asked before, and when I hesitated, she waited without filling the silence. That alone felt dangerous. Silence, when offered rather than imposed, can be unsettling. I told her about the recurring infections, the tightness that never released, the way certain sensations arrived already carrying panic. I spoke clinically, as if distance might protect me from the implications of my own words. She listened, took notes, and then asked about my childhood. The question landed with unexpected weight. I felt my body respond before my mind did, a subtle withdrawal, a reflex honed long ago. When I finally described what had been done, I used the language I had been given. Ceremony, rite, preparation. She did not interrupt, but I saw something shift in her expression, not shock, not pity, but recognition. When she spoke, she used different words. Injury, trauma, irreversible harm. The room seemed to tilt slightly, as if the floor had lost its certainty. Naming the pain did not lessen it, but it changed its shape. What had been framed as personal weakness was suddenly contextualized as consequence. The distinction was small and enormous at the same time. I left with pamphlets, referrals, and a diagnosis that felt both validating and devastating. There was relief in being believed and grief, in understanding how long I had been carrying this alone. In the weeks that followed, the name echoed everywhere. In my thoughts, in my dreams, in the way I caught my reflection and saw not just a body, but a history written into it. I read everything I could find, searching for myself in medical journals and survivor accounts. The patterns were unmistakable. The symptoms I thought were uniquely mine appeared again and again, described by people who had been told the same lies I had. Anger arrived late. It was not the explosive kind I had imagined, but something colder, more precise. It focused my attention. I began to see how carefully the language around what happened to us had been managed, how words were used to soften, to obscure, to sanctify. Tradition, I realized, was not a neutral inheritance but a tool, shaped and sharpened to ensure compliance. I thought about the women who had stood around me that day long ago, their faces serious, their hands steady. Many of them carried the same injuries. Some had died from them. I wondered how they had learned to reconcile love with harm, how many times they had repeated the words they were taught until those words became truth. Understanding did not erase responsibility, but it complicated my anger, forcing it to coexist with sorrow. At night, my body resisted rest. Memory surfaced without invitation, not as images but as sensations, pressure, heat, a sudden inability to breathe deeply. The diagnosis explained this too. Trauma does not reside only in thought, it lodges in muscle and nerve, waiting. Knowing this did not stop the episodes, but it gave me a framework, a way to observe without immediately condemning myself. What unsettled me most was the realization that the name I had been given for my condition was considered controversial in some circles. There were debates, defenses, careful arguments about cultural respect and external judgment. Reading them felt like being discussed in a room I was not allowed to enter, my body reduced to an abstract concept. I closed those articles with a sense of urgency that surprised me. Once pain has a name, silence becomes a choice rather than a default. I had not yet decided what I would do with that knowledge, but I felt something shifting, aligning. The understanding that what was done to me had a name meant it could be recognized, challenged, taught. It meant the story my body carried did not have to end in quiet endurance. That realization settled into me slowly, insistently, preparing me for a confrontation I could already sense on the horizon. When I returned to my family after receiving the diagnosis, I carried it like a concealed object, heavy and angular, pressing against my ribs. I did not announce it. I watched first. I listened to the familiar rhythms of conversation, the reverence with which certain names were spoken, the way decisions were justified by age rather than reason. Nothing had changed, and that continuity felt deliberate, almost defiant. The first person I told was my aunt, the one who had held my shoulders steady all those years ago. I chose her because she had always been described as kind, because kindness was supposed to mean safety. We sat across from each other with tea cooling between us, steam fading into the air. I spoke carefully, explaining the symptoms, the medical findings, the permanence. I waited for recognition to appear on her face, some flicker of accountability or regret. Instead, she nodded slowly, as if I were describing whether patterns she had lived with all her life. She told me pain was part of becoming, that endurance was a form of strength our people had always valued. When I said the word injury, she corrected me gently. It was not injury, she said. It was preparation. The word landed with practiced ease, polished by repetition. Others followed similar scripts. An older cousin warned me against letting outsiders define our practices. A family friend reminded me of the dangers of forgetting who we were. Each conversation felt less like dialogue and more like recitation. The promise they offered was always the same: belonging in exchange for silence, acceptance in exchange for obedience. What I had experienced was framed as a gift I was mishandling. What unsettled me most was how often love was invoked. They spoke of care, of protection, of ensuring a future unmarred by disgrace. Harm was described as preventative, violence as stewardship. I listened, my body tense, recognizing the logic that had shaped my own thinking for decades. This was the inheritance, a system that taught you to reinterpret your own suffering until it aligned with collective comfort. I asked questions then, quietly but persistently. I asked about the girls who had complications, about the ones who could not conceive, about the ones who died. The room grew colder with each inquiry. Answers became shorter, eyes more guarded. Some stories were dismissed as anomalies, others as divine will. Responsibility was dispersed so thoroughly it became untouchable. One evening, my mother sat beside me after everyone else had gone to sleep. She did not defend the practice outright. Instead, she spoke of fear. Fear of exclusion, of gossip, of being blamed for a daughter's perceived failure. She told me she had believed she was protecting me from a harsher world. Her voice shook when she said this, and for a moment, I saw the young woman she must have been, standing at the intersection of expectation and dread. Understanding her fear did not erase the consequences. My body was still altered, my health still compromised. The promise made on my behalf had been kept by breaking something in me, and no amount of intention could reverse that. Sitting there in the half-light, I realized that the elders' promise had never been about my well-being. It had been about continuity, about ensuring that no one questioned the cost of belonging. After that night, I stopped seeking validation from those rooms. I recognized the structure for what it was, a closed circle that sustained itself by absorbing dissent and labeling it betrayal. To remain inside meant accepting their definitions of harm and love, even when those definitions contradicted my lived reality. The clarity was painful but stabilizing, like setting a bone without anesthesia. I began to sense that my path forward would require something more disruptive than conversation. The promise offered to me was no longer sufficient, and refusing it carried consequences I could only partially imagine. Still, as I lay awake listening to the house settle around me, I felt a growing resolve. Whatever came next, it would have to start with rejecting the idea that my body was a necessary sacrifice. My body began refusing things long before my mind caught up. It refused long walks without warning, refused certain chairs, refused intimacy disguised as normalcy. The refusals were not dramatic. They were quiet withdrawals, small negotiations that accumulated until my life felt narrower than it should have been. For years, I interpreted these limits as personal shortcomings. Discipline, I was told, could correct most things. I tried to discipline pain. It did not respond. The first time my body openly rebelled was at work. I was in a meeting, fluorescent lights humming, voices overlapping in that polite, exhausting way, when a familiar pressure tightened suddenly into something sharper. Heat rushed through me, my vision blurred at the edges, and for a moment I could not tell where I was. I excused myself without explanation, locking myself in a bathroom stall where I sat on the floor, breathing in counts the way I had learned to do in secret. There was blood again, unexpected and humiliating in its persistence. I stared at it with a strange detachment, noting color and volume like data points, as if observation could replace feeling. When it stopped, I cleaned myself carefully and returned to the meeting, face composed, voice steady. No one noticed. That invisibility felt like both protection and indictment. Shame followed me everywhere. It lived in the gap between what my body needed and what the world assumed I could give. I declined invitations without explanation, avoided travel, structured my days around access to privacy and rest. Each accommodation felt like a small surrender. I told no one why. Explaining would require naming, and naming would invite questions I was not ready to answer. Doctors offered management, not resolution. Medications dulled symptoms but carried their own costs. Physical therapy helped in increments that felt insulting against the scale of what I had lost. Still, I complied. Compliance was familiar territory. I learned the language of treatment plans and follow-ups, nodding at appropriate moments, absorbing the unspoken understanding that this was as good as it would get. What disturbed me most was how often I was advised to reframe my expectations. Acceptance was presented as maturity, resignation as wisdom. I listened, outwardly agreeable, inwardly restless. There is a difference between accepting reality and being asked to normalize injustice, even when that injustice is already written into the body. My resistance was not loud yet, but it was forming. At night, my body spoke more clearly. Pain pulsed in rhythms that felt intentional, as if reminding me of something unfinished. Sleep came in fragments. Dreams blurred past and present, leaving me disoriented and raw in the mornings. I began writing then, not narratives, just notes about sensations, triggers, moments of unexpected relief. Mapping myself became a way of asserting that this body was still mine, not just an artifact of someone else's decision. The more I listened, the clearer the message became. My body was not broken in the abstract. It was responding logically to damage it had been taught to ignore. The symptoms were not betrayals, but signals. Recognizing this shifted something fundamental. Instead of fighting my body, I began to ally with it, even when that alliance required difficult choices. Those choices had consequences. Saying no more often changed how people saw me. Some accused me of exaggeration, others of fragility. A few offered sympathy that felt conditional, easily withdrawn if it became inconvenient. I learned quickly who required my silence to remain comfortable and who could tolerate the truth without needing to soften it. Each refusal, each boundary, felt like a small act of defiance against the narrative I had inherited. My body had said no long ago, in ways no one listened to. I was only just beginning to translate. The process was slow, uncomfortable, and necessary. Something was aligning at last, not into ease, but into honesty. And that honesty was already demanding more from me than quiet endurance ever had. The cost of staying became clearer the moment I stopped pretending I could still pay it. Belonging, I learned, was not a passive state, but an ongoing transaction. You gave up questions, autonomy, sometimes even language, and in return you were granted proximity, familiarity, the comfort of being mirrored. Once I disrupted that exchange by naming harm, the balance shifted, and the price rose sharply. Whispers followed me in rooms where my name used to be spoken warmly. Invitations arrived later or not at all. When they did, they came with conditions disguised as concern. I was advised to be careful with my words, reminded of how easily misunderstandings spread. The message was consistent even when the tone varied. My honesty was destabilizing, and stability mattered more than truth. I watched how quickly affection could harden into strategy. People who once praised my strength now framed my resistance as bitterness. They suggested I was projecting my personal difficulties onto a collective identity. It was unsettling how familiar the argument sounded, how neatly it echoed the lessons I had been taught as a child. Individual suffering was always inconvenient. It disrupted narratives designed to endure unchallenged. The pressure intensified when I began speaking outside the family, quietly at first to colleagues, to friends who asked careful questions. Each time I shared, I felt exposed and steadied at once. The relief of being heard was real, but so was the risk. Word traveled back faster than I expected. I was accused of exaggeration, of betrayal, of inviting judgment from people who did not understand us. One evening, a message arrived that was less subtle than the others. It reminded me of everything my community had given me, of the doors that could close just as easily as they had opened. The implication was unmistakable. Belonging was conditional, and I was approaching the limit of my allowance. I read it several times, my body tight, recognizing the familiar attempt to negotiate my silence. What surprised me was not the threat, but my response to it. Instead of fear, I felt a strange calm. I understood then that what they were offering me was not safety, but compliance. The belonging they defended required ongoing harm, not just to bodies like mine, but to truth itself. Accepting that meant accepting erasure, and I had already lost too much to agree to that again. I thought about younger girls, about how easily the cycle could continue if no one disrupted it. I thought about how long it had taken me to name my own pain, how close I had come to mistaking endurance for destiny. The realization settled with weight and clarity. The price of belonging, as it was being offered, was complicity. Choosing differently did not feel heroic. It felt isolating, heavy, and irreversible. I mourned the relationships I could sense slipping away, the ease I would never regain. But beneath that grief was a steadier conviction. If belonging required me to deny what my body knew to be true, then it was not belonging at all. I began to understand that stepping away was not a rejection of identity, but a refusal to let identity be used as justification for harm. That distinction mattered more than approval. As the distance grew, so did the space to breathe, to think, to imagine a life defined by consent rather than coercion. The cost was real, and it was ongoing. But for the first time, it was a cost I had chosen with open eyes. And that choice, fragile and difficult as it was, marked the moment when endurance began to give way to something else, something that would not allow me to turn back. The turning point did not announce itself with drama. It arrived quietly, on an ordinary morning, as I stood in front of the bathroom mirror tracing lines on my own face that I had never really studied before. 40 years of living had left marks there, some earned, some inherited, but my eyes looked different now. They were no longer searching for permission. I had avoided mirrors for most of my life, not consciously, but with the subtlety of habit. Looking too closely always stirred questions I had learned not to ask. That morning I did not look away. I examined my posture, the way my body held tension even in stillness, the slight asymmetry I compensated for without thinking. This was not self-criticism, it was inventory. For the first time, I wanted to see myself clearly, without the filters others had provided. The truth that settled in that moment was simple and destabilizing. What had been done to me was never about care. It was about control. That realization rearranged memories I thought I understood. The voices, the rituals, the reassurances all aligned into a single, unmistakable pattern. Love had been used as leverage. Fear had been disguised as guidance. Consent had never been part of the equation. I felt grief then, sharp and overdue. Not just for the body I might have had, but for the child I was, standing still because she had been told stillness was virtue. I mourned the years spent negotiating with pain instead of questioning its source, the relationships shaped by my willingness to endure. The grief was heavy, but it was honest, and honesty brought a strange steadiness with it. That steadiness carried me into conversations I had avoided. I spoke with a therapist who did not rush me toward forgiveness or acceptance. She allowed anger its full shape, allowed it to exist without requiring it to be softened or redirected. In that space, I said things out loud that had lived only in my body until then. Each sentence felt like reclaiming territory. I began to understand betrayal, not as a single act but as a structure. It was embedded in the expectation that I would reinterpret harm to preserve harmony, that I would prioritize continuity over my own integrity. Seeing this did not erase affection for the people involved, but it stripped away the illusion that affection excused everything. Accountability and love, I realized, were not mutually exclusive. We had simply been taught to pretend they were. There were moments of doubt. Late at night, I questioned whether clarity was worth the isolation it brought. I wondered if I was rewriting history to justify my distance, if memory itself was unreliable after so many years of silence. Each time, my body answered before my thoughts could spiral too far. Pain does not argue hypotheticals, it insists. The mirror became a ritual then, not of vanity but of grounding. Each morning, I reminded myself that this body was not a metaphor or a debate, it was evidence. It carried consequences that no theory could dissolve. Naming those consequences did not make me disloyal. It made me precise. As this understanding deepened, something else surfaced alongside it: responsibility. Not the kind imposed from outside, but the kind that emerges when denial is no longer possible. I could no longer claim ignorance, could no longer pretend that my silence was neutral. The truth had altered the landscape, and standing still within it felt like a choice I could no longer defend. I did not yet know what action would look like. I only knew that whatever came next would require me to be seen, fully and without translation. The mirror reflected a woman who was no longer willing to be a symbol or a cautionary footnote. I turned away from it that morning with a sense of inevitability, aware that the next steps would carry risk, and equally aware that retreat was no longer an option. The first public words I spoke were smaller than the silence they broke, but they carried farther than I expected. A panel discussion, a modest room, rows of chairs filled with people who came for professional reasons and stayed because something in the air shifted. I did not raise my voice. I did not dramatize. I spoke the way my body had taught me to speak, carefully, precisely, without ornament. I described consequences instead of rituals. I talked about chronic pain, infections, fear that settled into muscle and never fully left. I did not name individuals or communities. I named outcomes. Even so, I felt the circle tightening as I spoke, an invisible boundary reacting to pressure. When I finished, the room was quiet in a way that felt attentive rather than stunned. Then questions came, hesitant but sincere. Afterward, people approached me one by one. Some thanked me without explanation. Others shared fragments of their own histories, speaking quickly as if afraid time might run out. I recognized the look in their eyes, the relief of recognition paired with the fear of being seen. I had worn that expression for decades. Seeing it mirrored back at me was both grounding and devastating. The response outside that room was less gentle. Messages arrived accusing me of airing what should remain private, of fueling prejudice, of misunderstanding my own past. The arguments were familiar, but their volume had increased. What I had said could no longer be contained within family conversations or whispered warnings. It existed now in shared space, subject to interpretation and attack. I felt the pull to retreat, to soften my language, to add disclaimers that might reassure those invested in the old narratives. But each time I considered it, my body reacted with a clarity that surprised me. Tightness, nausea, that familiar pressure behind the eyes. This was what compromise felt like when it crossed into self-erasure. I learned to listen. Breaking the circle did not mean walking away cleanly. It meant standing still while others moved around me, recalibrating their positions. Some relationships dissolved quietly. Others erupted before collapsing. A few surprised me by holding, reshaping themselves around a truth they had never been asked to face. Those connections felt tentative but real, built on something sturdier than obligation. There were nights when doubt pressed hard. I replayed conversations, scrutinized my words for unintended harm. I questioned whether education justified the personal cost. Each time, I returned to the same conclusion. Silence had not protected me, and it would not protect those who came after me. Whatever discomfort I was experiencing now was not new. It was simply visible. I began working with others who had made similar choices, people who understood the peculiar loneliness of speaking against something framed as sacred. Together, we compared notes, supported one another through backlash, shared strategies for staying grounded. There was no script for this, no inherited wisdom. We were improvising, learning in real time what resistance looked like when it was rooted in lived experience. The circle did not shatter all at once. It fractured slowly, hairline cracks spreading with each refusal to recant, each insistence on naming harm without apology. I learned that breaking a cycle rarely feels triumphant. It feels exhausting, uncertain, and necessary. The absence of immediate resolution did not mean failure. It meant the work was real. As weeks turned into months, I noticed something subtle but profound. My body, while still marked by pain, felt less burdened by concealment. The effort of holding everything in had been costing me more than I realized. Letting truth circulate, even imperfectly, reduced that load. It did not heal the injury, but it altered my relationship to it. I knew the consequences were not finished revealing themselves. Speaking had shifted the balance, and systems built on silence do not adapt quietly. Still, as I moved forward, I carried a steadier sense of alignment. The circle I had broken was not the one that defined me. It was the one that depended on my quiet to survive. The room where I testified was smaller than I imagined, almost ordinary, and that ordinariness unsettled me more than any grand setting could have. Beige walls, a long table, microphones positioned with bureaucratic precision. It did not look like a place where lives were altered, yet that was exactly what it was designed to do. I sat there aware of every point of contact between my body and the chair, grounding myself in sensation to keep from drifting. I spoke slowly, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted each word to land intact. I described timelines, symptoms, medical findings. I avoided metaphor. I avoided apology. Across the table, people took notes, nodded, occasionally asked clarifying questions. Their neutrality felt strange after months of charged reactions. Here, my pain was not an inconvenience or a provocation. It was data. Still, neutrality has its own weight. I noticed how easily the room could turn what I said into abstraction, how suffering could be translated into policy language that risked losing its edges. When that happened, I brought it back to the body. I described mornings shaped by pain, nights interrupted by memory, choices narrowed by damage that could not be reversed. I reminded them, gently but firmly, that this was not theoretical. Afterward, a woman approached me in the hallway. She did not introduce herself immediately. She simply said she wished someone had spoken when she was younger. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled. We stood there for a moment, two strangers connected by something neither of us had chosen. When she thanked me, I understood that testimony was not just about institutions. It was about recognition. The backlash intensified soon after. Articles appeared that framed voices like mine as divisive, dangerous to cohesion. Online messages grew sharper, more personal. Some accused me of fabricating harm for attention. Others warned me of consequences if I continued. I learned to document everything, to measure threats without dismissing them. Fear returned, but it was different now. It no longer had the power of the unknown. What sustained me were the messages that came quietly, often anonymously. Short notes, carefully worded, from people who could not yet speak publicly. They described bodies like mine, lives shaped by the same early violation, questions they were only beginning to allow themselves. Reading them, I felt the scope of what had been hidden. Silence had not been absence, it had been accumulation. There were days I wanted to stop. Fatigue settled deep, heavier than pain. I resented the expectation that I would continue educating, continue explaining, continue absorbing hostility with composure. On those days, I returned to my notes, to the records that reminded me why I had begun. This was not about convincing everyone. It was about ensuring that denial was no longer the only narrative available. The witness room stayed with me, not as a single place but as a concept. Any space where truth is spoken in the face of resistance becomes one. Sometimes it is formal, with microphones and minutes recorded. Sometimes it is a kitchen table, a late-night phone call, a message sent with shaking hands. Each time, the act is the same, stepping forward without guarantee of safety. As the months passed, I noticed subtle shifts. Language in official documents changed. Questions once dismissed were now acknowledged. Progress was uneven and slow, but it was real. I learned to hold that alongside ongoing threats, to accept that transformation rarely arrives without friction. Systems that have relied on silence do not surrender it easily. What surprised me most was how my body responded. Pain did not disappear, but it became less consuming. The constant vigilance softened. Speaking had not healed the injury, but it had altered the environment around it. I was no longer carrying the weight alone. The witness room, in all its forms, had multiplied, and with it came a sense of shared reality that no backlash could fully erase. The first sign was the knock, measured, deliberate, too controlled to be mistaken for coincidence. It came late, after the city had settled into that fragile quiet where every sound feels amplified. I froze where I was standing, heart racing ahead of thought. My body recognized the danger before my mind assembled the context. That instinct had never failed me. I did not open the door. Instead, I moved slowly, turning off lights, checking the lock on the back entrance, the windows. My phone vibrated with messages arriving faster than I could read them. Warnings, questions. Someone had shared my address. Someone had decided conversation was no longer sufficient. From the hallway, I heard voices, familiar in tone even if I could not place them exactly. The language they used was calm, almost affectionate. They spoke my name the way it had been spoken when I was younger, as if summoning that version of me might restore order. They said they wanted to talk, to clear misunderstandings, to protect me from myself. The script was old, but the setting made it feel newly dangerous. I stood there, breathing shallowly, aware of how exposed I was. The fear was not abstract. It pressed into my chest, tightened my jaw, sent heat into my limbs. I thought about calling for help and hesitated, not because I doubted the seriousness of the situation, but because part of me was still negotiating with the reflex to minimize, to handle things quietly. That reflex had been trained into me with precision. The knocking grew louder, less polite, words sharpened. I caught fragments, accusations framed as concern, warnings disguised as advice. They reminded me of everything I owed, everything I risked losing. They spoke of reputation, of consequences, of how easily things could escalate if I continued down this path. Listening, I understood something with chilling clarity. This was not about misunderstanding. It was about enforcement. I retreated to the bathroom, the smallest room, instinctively seeking containment. Sitting on the floor, back against the wall, I focused on keeping my breath steady. My body was shaking, but my thoughts were precise. I documented what I could, timestamps, messages, recordings. Preparation replaced panic. This, too, was a form of resistance. When the voices finally faded, the silence they left behind felt unstable, as if it could collapse at any moment. I did not sleep that night. I sat with the lights on, phone in hand, replaying the encounter in fragments. Fear lingered, but beneath it was something else, anger stripped of illusion. Any lingering hope that dialogue alone could resolve this evaporated. In the days that followed, I adjusted my life again. Security measures, altered routines, conversations with people trained to assess risk rather than minimize it. Each step felt surreal, like I had crossed into a reality I was never meant to inhabit. Speaking had not only broken silence, it had exposed how invested some were in restoring it by force. What haunted me most was not the threat itself, but its familiarity. The tactics mirrored the original harm: insistence without consent, pressure framed as care, control justified as protection. The pattern was unmistakable. Seeing it repeated confirmed what I had been saying all along. This was not tradition. It was domination rehearsed across generations. There were moments when exhaustion threatened to undo me. I questioned whether any outcome could justify this level of intrusion, this constant vigilance. Each time, I returned to the same anchor. Retreat would not undo what had been set in motion. Silence would not guarantee safety. It had never done so before. The night they came back marked a threshold. After it, there was no illusion of neutrality, no pretense that this was merely an intellectual disagreement. The stakes were explicit now, written not just in policy debates or hostile messages, but in physical proximity, in raised voices outside a locked door. Surviving that night did not make me fearless. It made me resolute. Whatever remained ahead would require endurance of a different kind, not the quiet suffering I had been taught, but the sustained courage to remain visible when disappearance would be easier. I did not yet know how that endurance would be tested, only that it would be. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that turning back was no longer possible. I speak differently now. Not louder, not with more force, but with a precision that comes from having nothing left to protect except the truth. After that night, fear stopped being a warning and became a companion, unwelcome, persistent, but no longer in control. I learned how to move with it rather than against it, how to let it sharpen my awareness without dictating my silence. My body remains marked. pain still arrives without invitation. Some mornings are slower than others, shaped by limits I did not choose. Healing, I have learned, does not always mean restoration. Sometimes it means integration, learning how to live fully in a body that carries evidence. What was done to me cannot be undone, but it can be understood, and that understanding has weight. I am asked now to explain, to teach, to summarize my experience into something consumable. I resist that impulse. What happened to me is not a lesson because it was useful. It is a lesson because it was harmful. Education, when it matters, does not sanitize damage. It names it clearly enough that repetition becomes harder to justify. When I speak to younger people, I do not offer resilience as a virtue. I talk about consent, about bodily autonomy, about the difference between heritage and harm. I tell them that tradition is not sacred by default, that anything requiring silence to survive deserves scrutiny. I watch their faces as recognition dawns, as questions form that they have been taught not to ask. In those moments, I feel the quiet power of interruption. There is grief in this work. Grief for the self I might have been, for relationships permanently altered, for the years spent negotiating with pain instead of challenging its source. I allow that grief now. It does not weaken me. It keeps me honest. Pretending indifference was far more corrosive. What steadies me most is the knowledge that my body's testimony is irrefutable. It exists regardless of belief, regardless of debate. Scar tissue does not argue. Nerves remember. Biology does not bend to ideology. My skin carries a record that no rhetoric can erase, and that record demands accountability, not reverence. I no longer accept language that blurs harm into abstraction. I correct it when I hear it calmly, firmly. Words matter because they shape what people believe is possible, permissible, inevitable. Changing them does not solve everything, but it changes the ground on which decisions are made. That shift alone can alter lives. There are still consequences. Safety is something I manage consciously now, not something I assume. Visibility carries risk, and I am realistic about that. But invisibility carried its own dangers, quieter and more enduring. Between the two, I have chosen the risk that at least allows for change. If there is a warning in what my body carries, it is this. Harm does not become harmless because it is familiar, and pain does not transform into virtue because it is shared. Calling something tradition does not absolve it of its effects. The body keeps its own record, and eventually, that record demands to be read. I am 40 years old. What was done to my body never healed. But I am no longer waiting for permission to say so. And if my words reach even one person before silence does, then this body, scarred, altered, enduring, has already taught something that no ritual ever could.